Have you ever wondered what really happens in those forgotten cabins deep in the Appalachian Mountains, where the mist never lifts and the trees seem to whisper your name? Tonight, I'm going to share 3 true stories that will make you think twice before ever stepping foot in those woods. These aren't just old campfire tales, these are chilling accounts from people who survived nights filled with unexplainable screams, ghostly visitors, and things that claw at your door when the fog rolls in. Some say the mountains remember every secret, every sin, and sometimes they come calling for you. So turn off the lights, lock your doors, and listen closely. Because once you hear these stories, you'll never look at a lonely cabin the same way again. I never believed in ghost stories, not really. I grew up in the city, where the scariest thing you'd see at night was a stray dog or maybe a drunk stumbling home. But that all changed the summer I agreed to help my uncle fix up his old hunting cabin deep in the Appalachian Mountains. I was 19, broke, and desperate for a change of scenery. My uncle, a wiry man with a permanent 5 o'clock shadow, promised me a few $100 and all the fresh air I could breathe. I figured, why not? The drive out there was long and winding, the kind of road that makes you lose cell service and question your life choices. The trees grew thick and close, their branches clawing at the sky. By the time I reached the cabin, the sun was already dipping behind the mountains, painting the sky in bruised purples and reds. The cabin itself looked like something out of a horror movie. Weathered wood, a sagging porch, and windows that stared out like empty eyes. My uncle greeted me with a clap on the back and a grin. "Glad you made it, kid. Place needs some work, but she's got good bones." He handed me a flashlight and a set of keys. "We'll start in the morning. For now, get settled in. I'll be back at dawn." He left me alone with the creaking silence of the woods. I unpacked my bag, set up my sleeping bag on the old cot, and tried not to think about how far I was from civilization. The only sounds were the chirping of crickets and the occasional hoot of an owl. I told myself it was peaceful, not creepy. But as the night wore on, a thick fog rolled in, swallowing the trees and turning the world outside the windows into a swirling gray void. I tried to read by flashlight, but the silence pressed in on me, heavy and suffocating. That's when I saw it, a faint, flickering light moving through the fog, maybe 50 yards from the cabin. At first I thought it was my uncle, maybe coming back to check on me, but the light was too steady, too deliberate. It bobbed and weaved, like someone carrying an old lantern. I pressed my face to the window, squinting into the mist. The light moved closer, slow and steady, until I could just make out the shape of a figure behind it, tall, thin, and wrapped in what looked like a long coat or cloak. My heart hammered in my chest. I told myself it was just a hiker, maybe someone lost in the woods. But who hikes at midnight, in the middle of nowhere, carrying a lantern? I watched as the figure stopped just at the edge of the clearing, the light casting long, twisted shadows across the fog. For a moment, it just stood there, unmoving. Then, as if sensing my gaze, the lantern swung in my direction. I stumbled back from the window, my breath coming in short, panicked bursts. I fumbled for my phone, but of course there was no signal. I considered running outside, but the thought of stepping into that fog with that thing out there made my skin crawl. I locked the door, checked the windows, and tried to convince myself it was all in my head. But the light didn't go away. It circled the cabin, slow and methodical, like a predator stalking its prey. Every so often it would pause, the figure behind it barely visible through the swirling mist. I could hear the faint crunch of footsteps on the gravel, the creak of old wood as the porch boards shifted under unseen weight. I sat on the floor, clutching the flashlight like a lifeline, listening to the sounds of the night. Hours seemed to pass. The lantern's glow faded and reappeared, always just out of sight, always moving. At some point, exhaustion took over, and I must have dozed off, because the next thing I knew, sunlight was streaming through the windows and the fog was gone. I stumbled outside, half expecting to find footprints or some sign of the night's visitor, but the ground was undisturbed, the only tracks my own from the day before. I tried to laugh it off, blaming it on nerves and an overactive imagination, but the memory of that lantern swinging in the fog stuck with me. My uncle arrived a little after dawn, whistling as he unloaded tools from his truck. I tried to tell him about the figure, the lantern, the way it circled the cabin. He just shrugged. "Old mountain stories," he said. "People see all kinds of things in the fog. Don't let it get to you." We spent the day patching up the roof and clearing brush from around the cabin. I tried to focus on the work, but every time I glanced at the tree line, I half expected to see that lantern flickering in the shadows. My uncle didn't seem bothered, but I caught him glancing at the woods more than once, his eyes narrowed and wary. That night, the fog returned, thicker than before. My uncle decided to stay over just in case. We played cards by lantern light, the old kind with a glass chimney and a flickering flame. The shadows danced on the walls and every creak of the cabin made me jump. Around midnight we heard it, a soft rhythmic tapping on the porch. My uncle froze, his eyes wide. The tapping grew louder, more insistent, like someone knocking with the back of their hand. My uncle motioned for me to stay quiet. We listened, barely breathing, as the tapping moved from the front door to the windows, circling the cabin just like the lantern had the night before. I wanted to look, to see if the figure was out there, but fear rooted me to the spot. My uncle grabbed his old hunting rifle and crept to the window, peeking through a crack in the curtain. He went pale, his hands shaking. "It's back," he whispered. "Stay away from the windows." The tapping stopped. For a moment, there was only silence. Then, from somewhere deep in the fog, we heard a voice, soft, almost musical, calling out a name neither of us recognized. It echoed through the trees, growing fainter and fainter until it was swallowed by the night. We didn't sleep. We just sat there, waiting for dawn, listening to the fog press against the cabin like a living thing. When the first gray light of morning crept through the windows, my uncle and I finally let ourselves breathe. The fog had thinned, but it still clung to the ground in ghostly patches. Neither of us said much as we made coffee and tried to shake off the night. My uncle's hands trembled as he poured his cup, and I noticed he kept glancing at the door, as if expecting that soft tapping to start up again. After breakfast, we stepped outside together. The porch boards groaned under our weight, but there was no sign of anyone, or anything, having been there. No footprints, no scuff marks, not even a smudge on the dusty windows. It was as if the night had swallowed up all evidence of what we'd heard. I tried to laugh it off, but my uncle wasn't having it. "You ever hear of a will-o'-the-wisp?" he asked, his voice low. "Old mountain folks say they're spirits, leading travelers astray. Sometimes they say it's the dead looking for company." I wanted to believe it was just a story, but the memory of that lantern swinging in the fog made my skin crawl. We spent the day working in silence, both of us jumpy at every sound. The woods felt different now, closer, heavier, as if they were watching us. That afternoon I found something strange at the edge of the clearing. Half buried in the moss was an old, rusted lantern. The glass was cracked and the handle was twisted, but it looked just like the one I'd seen in the fog. I called my uncle over and he stared at it for a long time before picking it up. "This belonged to my grandfather," he said quietly. "He disappeared out here, years before you were born. Folks searched for weeks, but all they ever found was his lantern, left out by the old well." A chill ran down my spine. "You think it's him?" My uncle shook his head, but he didn't look convinced. Sometimes the mountains keep their own secrets. That night, the fog rolled in even thicker, swallowing the cabin in a suffocating gray blanket. My uncle and I sat by the lantern, the only light in the darkness. We didn't talk much. Every so often I thought I saw movement outside the window, a flicker of light, a shadow slipping between the trees. Around midnight, the tapping started again. This time it was louder, more urgent, as if someone was desperate to get in. My uncle gripped his rifle, his knuckles white. I could hear my own heartbeat thundering in my ears. Then, the voice came again, soft, pleading, calling out that same unfamiliar name. It sounded closer this time, almost right outside the door. My uncle stood up, his face pale and drawn. "I have to see," he whispered. "I have to know if it's him." Before I could stop him, he opened the door and stepped out into the fog. The lantern's light spilled onto the porch, casting long, twisted shadows. I watched as my uncle disappeared into the mist, the rifle clutched in his hands. For a moment, there was only silence. Then I heard voices, two of them, low and urgent, speaking in a language I didn't understand. The fog seemed to pulse and shift, swallowing up the sound. I called out for my uncle, but my voice was swallowed by the mist. Minutes passed, maybe hours. I lost all sense of time. Finally, I saw a shape moving through the fog, stumbling toward the cabin. It was my uncle, his face ashen, his eyes wide with terror. He collapsed onto the porch, gasping for breath. "It's not him," he whispered. "It's not anyone. It's wrong. It's just wearing his face." I dragged him inside and locked the door. He wouldn't say anything else, just sat there, rocking back and forth, staring at the old lantern on the table. The tapping didn't come back that night, but neither of us slept. When dawn finally broke, my uncle packed his things and told me we were leaving. "This place isn't safe," he said. "Not for us, not for anyone." We drove out of the mountains in silence, the fog trailing behind us like a living thing. I never went back to that cabin, and my uncle sold the land a few months later. Sometimes late at night, I still see that lantern swinging in the fog when I close my eyes. I hear the tapping on the windows, the voice calling out a name I'll never know. I don't tell people this story anymore. Most wouldn't believe it. But if you ever find yourself alone in the Appalachian woods and you see a lantern flickering in the fog, don't follow it. Don't answer the voice. And whatever you do, don't open the door. If you've ever spent a night in the Appalachian woods, you know the silence isn't really silent. There's always something moving, something whispering just out of sight. I learned that the hard way. The summer my best friend Tyler and I decided to rent a remote cabin for a week of hiking and fishing. We were both city kids, used to the hum of traffic and the glow of streetlights, so the idea of unplugging in the middle of nowhere sounded like paradise. The cabin was old, tucked deep in a hollow where the trees grew so thick they blocked out the sun. The air was heavy with the smell of moss and wet earth. The only way in was a rutted dirt road that twisted through the woods for miles. The owner, a grizzled old man named Mr. Harlan, handed us the keys and gave us a warning before he left. "Stay out of the ravine behind the cabin," he said, his voice gravelly. "Roots run deep there, deeper than you think." Tyler laughed it off, but I saw the way Mr. Harlan's eyes lingered on the tree line, like he was remembering something he'd rather forget. The first couple of days were perfect. We fished in the creek, hiked the trails, and spent our nights around the fire, telling ghost stories and roasting marshmallows. But on the third night, something changed. The air felt heavier, the woods quieter. Even the crickets seemed to have gone silent. It started with a sound, low and distant, like someone crying out in pain. At first I thought it was an animal, maybe a fox or a bobcat. But the longer I listened, the more it sounded human. A long, drawn-out wail that echoed through the trees, rising and falling like the wind. Tyler heard it too. "Probably just a coyote," he said, but his voice was shaky. We tried to ignore it, but the screaming didn't stop. It went on for hours, sometimes fading, sometimes so loud it seemed to come from right outside the cabin. Neither of us slept much that night. When the sun finally rose, we found the woods shrouded in a thick, unnatural mist. The trees looked twisted, their roots bulging out of the ground like veins. I tried to shake off the feeling of unease, but it clung to me like a second skin. That afternoon, Tyler decided to explore the ravine Mr. Harlan had warned us about. I tried to talk him out of it, but he just grinned and said, "What's the worst that could happen?" I followed him, more out of fear of being alone than any real curiosity. The ravine was deeper than it looked from the cabin, a gash in the earth choked with tangled roots and fallen branches. The air was cooler down there, damp and heavy. The ground squished under our boots and the trees leaned in close, their roots snaking across the soil like fingers. We didn't find anything at first, just mud, rocks, and the occasional animal bone. But then Tyler spotted something half buried at the base of a massive oak. It was a wooden box, old and rotting, its lid warped and splintered. He pried it open with a stick, and inside we found a bundle of faded photographs, a rusted locket, and a handful of yellowed letters. The photos were old, black and white, showing a family standing in front of the very cabin we were staying in. The letters were written in a shaky hand, the ink smudged and hard to read. Most of them were addressed to someone named Eleanor. The last letter was different. The handwriting was frantic, the words scrawled across the page. "The roots are hungry. They won't let me leave. If you find this, please forgive me." A chill ran down my spine. Tyler just laughed, tossing the box aside. "Probably just some old mountain superstition," he said. But I couldn't shake the feeling that we'd disturbed something that should have been left alone. That night, the screaming started again, louder this time, closer. It sounded like a woman, her voice raw with terror. We huddled inside the cabin, every light on, listening as the wails echoed through the woods. At one point, I thought I saw something moving outside the window, a pale shape slipping between the trees, its hair tangled with roots and dirt. Tyler tried to act brave, but I could see the fear in his eyes. "We should leave," I whispered. He nodded, but neither of us moved. The screaming went on until dawn, fading only when the first light touched the treetops. The next morning we found the ground around the cabin torn up, as if something had clawed its way out of the earth. The roots were exposed, twisted and gnarled, some of them stained dark with what looked like old blood. Tyler wanted to leave right then, but the car wouldn't start. The engine just clicked and sputtered, refusing to turn over. We spent the day trying to fix it, but nothing worked. The woods felt even more oppressive, the trees pressing in on all sides. Every so often I thought I heard whispers coming from the ravine, soft and urgent, like someone calling for help. That night, the screaming returned, louder than ever. It sounded like it was coming from right beneath the cabin, shaking the floorboards and rattling the windows. We barricaded the doors and windows, but it didn't help. The roots began to move, snaking up through the cracks in the floor, writhing like living things. Tyler grabbed a hatchet and started hacking at the roots, but they just kept coming, thicker and stronger. I could hear voices in the wailing now, pleading, begging, warning us to leave. And then just as suddenly as it started, the screaming stopped. The roots went still, the cabin falling silent except for the sound of our own ragged breathing. We sat there in the dark, too scared to move, listening to TT's silence press in around us. I could still feel the roots under my feet, pulsing with a slow, steady rhythm like the heartbeat of something ancient and angry. Tyler's hands were shaking so badly he dropped the hatchet. I picked it up, gripping it tight, not sure if it would do any good. When the sun finally rose, the roots shrank back into the floor, leaving behind splinters and dark stains. We didn't talk about what happened. We just packed our bags and tried the car again, but it was dead as a doornail. No cell service, no way to call for help. We were trapped. We decided to hike out, following the dirt road back toward town. The woods felt different in the daylight, still but watchful, like the trees were waiting for something. As we passed the ravine, I glanced down and saw the ground was torn up, roots exposed and writhing in the morning breeze. I thought I saw a face in the dirt, pale and twisted, mouth open in a silent scream, but when I blinked, it was gone. We walked for hours, but the road seemed to twist and double back on itself. No matter how far we went, we always ended up back at the cabin. The sun was high overhead, but the shadows under the trees never moved. Tyler started to panic, yelling and cursing, throwing rocks at the trees. The woods swallowed up his voice, the echoes dying before they could reach the sky. We tried to retrace our steps, but the forest closed in tighter, the roots snaking across the path, tripping us up, grabbing at our ankles. I could hear whispers in the wind, voices calling my name, promising safety if I just let go, just lay down and rest. By the time we stumbled back to the cabin, we were exhausted and half crazed with fear. The sun was setting, the shadows growing long and deep. Tyler collapsed on the porch, sobbing. I sat beside him, too tired to cry. That night, the screaming started again, but this time it was inside the cabin. The walls shook, the floor buckled, and the roots burst through the floorboards, wrapping around Tyler's legs and dragging him toward the ravine. He screamed, clawing at the wood, but the roots were too strong. I tried to help, hacking at them with the hatchet, but they just kept coming, pulling him out the door and into the darkness. I chased after him, stumbling through the trees, the screams echoing all around me. The ravine was alive with movement, roots writhing and twisting, pulling Tyler down into the earth. I saw his face, pale and terrified, before the roots closed over him, swallowing him whole. I fell to my knees, sobbing, the hatchet slipping from my fingers. The roots slithered around me, but they didn't touch me. Instead, they pulled back, sinking into the ground, leaving the ravine silent and still. I don't remember how I got back to the cabin. I must have passed out because when I woke up it was morning. The car was gone. The road clear. The woods quiet, I stumbled out to the main road and flagged down a passing truck. The driver, an old woman with sharp eyes, didn't ask any questions. She just drove me to the nearest town and dropped me off at the diner. I tried to tell the police what happened, but they didn't believe me. They searched the cabin, found no sign of Tyler, no sign of the roots, nothing but an old empty box at the edge of the ravine. They said he must have run off, gotten lost in the woods. But I know the truth. Sometimes, late at night, I hear the screaming in my dreams. I see the roots writhing in the darkness, hungry and restless. I see Tyler's face, pale and twisted, calling out for help. I know I'll never go back to those woods, never set foot near that cabin again. But sometimes, when the wind is just right, I catch the scent of moss and wet earth, and I remember the warning Mr. Harlan gave us. Roots run deep there, deeper than you think. If you ever find yourself in the Appalachian woods, and you hear someone screaming in the night, don't go looking for them. Don't follow the sound. And whatever you do, stay out of the ravine. If you ask anyone in my family about Devil's Hollow, they'll tell you it's just a name. An old patch of woods in the Appalachian foothills, nothing more. But I know better. I spent a week there, alone, in a cabin that belonged to my late grandfather, and I'll never forget what happened. It started with a letter. My grandfather passed away in the spring. And a few months later, I got a package from his lawyer. Inside was a key, a hand-drawn map, and a note in my grandfather's shaky handwriting. Spend a week at the cabin. There's something you need to see. Don't leave after dark. I was 24, fresh out of college and between jobs. The idea of a free vacation in the mountains sounded perfect. I packed my bags, loaded up my old Jeep, and followed the map deep into the hills. The road narrowed to a single lane, then turned to gravel, then to dirt. By the time I reached the cabin, the sun was already low, painting the sky in streaks of orange and gold. The cabin was small but sturdy, tucked into a clearing surrounded by ancient trees. The air was thick with the smell of pine and damp earth. I unlocked the door and stepped inside, half expecting to find it dusty and abandoned. But everything was neat, almost as if my grandfather had just stepped out for a walk. There was a faded photograph of him on the mantel, smiling in front of the same cabin, a hunting rifle slung over his shoulder. I spent the first day exploring the woods, following the trails my grandfather had marked on the map. The forest was beautiful, but there was something off about it, an unnatural stillness, as if the birds and animals were holding their breath. I shrugged it off as nerves and spent the evening reading by the fireplace. That night I remembered my grandfather's warning, don't leave after dark. I locked the doors and windows, just in case, and tried to sleep. But sometime after midnight I woke to the sound of footsteps crunching in the gravel outside. At first I thought it was a deer or maybe a bear, but the footsteps were too slow, too deliberate. They circled the cabin, pausing every few steps, as if whoever or whatever was out there was looking for something. My heart pounded in my chest. I lay perfectly still, listening as the footsteps moved to the front porch. The boards creaked under the weight, and then there was a soft, rhythmic tapping on the door. I didn't move. I barely breathed. The tapping continued, slow and patient, for what felt like hours. Then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. The footsteps retreated into the woods, swallowed by the darkness. The next morning I found muddy footprints on the porch, bare feet, long and narrow, with toes that seemed too long, almost claw-like. I tried to convince myself it was just a trick of the light, maybe a raccoon or some other animal. But deep down, I knew better. The days passed in a blur. Every night the footsteps returned, circling the cabin, tapping on the doors and windows. I tried to ignore them, but the fear grew with each passing night. I started seeing things in the woods, shadows that moved against the wind, shapes that slipped between the trees when I wasn't looking. On the fourth night, I heard a voice. It was soft, almost a whisper, calling my name from the edge of the clearing. I froze, my skin crawling. The voice was familiar, my grandfather's, or at least it sounded like him, but I knew he was dead. I stayed in bed, clutching the covers, listening as the voice called out again and again, growing more insistent. The next morning I found something strange on the porch, a bundle of wildflowers tied with a piece of red string. The flowers were fresh, their petals still wet with dew. I didn't touch them, I just stared, wondering who or what had left them there. That day, I hiked to the far edge of the property, following a trail that led to a rocky outcrop overlooking the hollow. The view was breathtaking, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I turned to head back, and that's when I saw it. A figure standing among the trees, tall and thin, its face hidden in shadow. It didn't move, didn't make a sound. I blinked, and it was gone. I ran back to the cabin, heart pounding, and locked the door behind me. That night, the footsteps were louder, the tapping more urgent. The voice returned, pleading with me to open the door, to let it in. I covered my ears and tried to block it out, but the words seeped into my mind, cold and sharp as ice. "Let me in, I'm so cold, please let me in." I don't know how I made it through the night. When the sun finally rose, I found the wildflowers on the porch again, this time wilted and blackened as if they'd been burned. The footprints were back, circling the cabin, pressed deep into the mud. I wanted to leave, but something kept me there. A sense of duty, maybe, or just plain stubbornness. My grandfather had asked me to stay a week, and I was determined to see it through. But as the days wore on, the fear grew, gnawing at my nerves until I was jumping at every sound. On the 6th night, the visitor came to the window. I was sitting by the fire, trying to read, when I saw a pale face pressed against the glass. The eyes were black and empty, the mouth twisted in a silent scream. I stumbled back, knocking over the chair, but when I looked again, the face was gone. I locked myself in the bedroom, barricading the door with a dresser. The footsteps circled the cabin all night, the voice whispering through the cracks in the walls. I didn't sleep. I just sat there, clutching the rifle my grandfather had left behind, waiting for dawn. When the first light of morning crept through the curtains, I finally let myself breathe. My hands were cramped from gripping the rifle all night, and my eyes burned from lack of sleep. I waited until the sun was high before I dared to leave the bedroom. The cabin was silent, but the air felt heavy, as if something was still lurking just out of sight. I checked the porch. The wildflowers were there again, this time arranged in a perfect circle. Each stem snapped at the same angle. The muddy footprints were everywhere, circling the cabin, pressed so deep into the earth it looked like something had been pacing for hours. I felt a wave of dread wash over me. I knew I couldn't stay another night. I packed my things in a hurry, barely stopping to eat. I grabbed the map, the keys, and my grandfather's rifle, and locked the door behind me. The woods were quiet as I made my way to the Jeep, but every step felt like I was being watched. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see that pale face staring at me from the trees. The Jeep started on the first try, but as I pulled onto the dirt road, I saw something in the rearview mirror, a figure standing in the clearing, tall and thin, its face hidden in shadow. I pressed the gas, heart pounding, and didn't look back. The road twisted through the woods, the trees crowding in on all sides. The farther I drove, the thicker the fog became, until I could barely see the hood of the Jeep. The world outside was silent, the only sound the crunch of gravel under the tires. I kept my eyes on the road, gripping the wheel so tight my knuckles turned white. Then out of the corner of my eye I saw movement, a flash of white darting between the trees. The voice returned, soft and pleading, echoing through the fog. "Let me in, please, let me in." I floored the gas, desperate to get away. The fog grew thicker, swirling around the Jeep like living smoke. The road seemed to stretch on forever, twisting and turning, never leading anywhere. I felt a cold hand brush the back of my neck, and I nearly lost control of the car. Suddenly, the fog parted, and I found myself back at the cabin. I slammed on the brakes, staring in disbelief. The clearing was empty, the cabin dark and silent. I tried to turn the Jeep around, but the engine sputtered and died. I was trapped. I stumbled out of the car, rifle in hand, and ran to the cabin. The door was unlocked, swinging open on rusty hinges. Inside, everything was just as I'd left it, except for the wildflowers, now scattered across the floor, their petals black and shriveled. The voice was louder now, echoing through the rooms, filling the air with cold, desperate whispers. "Let me in. I'm so cold, please let me in." I backed into the bedroom, slamming the door and shoving the dresser in front of it. The footsteps returned, circling the cabin, tapping on the windows and doors. The walls shook, the floorboards creaked, and the air grew colder with every passing minute. I clutched the rifle, heart racing as the voice grew louder, more insistent. The footsteps stopped outside the bedroom door. The handle rattled, and I heard a soft scraping sound like fingernails on wood. Then the door burst open, and the room was filled with blinding white light. I saw the figure standing in the doorway, tall and thin, its face a pale mask of sorrow and hunger. Its eyes were black and empty, its mouth twisted in a silent scream. I tried to raise the rifle, but my arms wouldn't move. The figure glided toward me, its feet not touching the ground. The air grew icy, my breath turning to mist. The voice filled my head, drowning out all other thoughts. "Let me in. I'm so cold. Please, let me in." I don't remember what happened next. I must have blacked out because when I opened my eyes, it was morning. The cabin was empty, the door wide open, sunlight streaming through the windows. The wildflowers were gone, the footprints erased. I stumbled outside, blinking in the bright light. The Jeep started without a problem, and the road led straight out of the woods, as if nothing had ever happened. I drove for hours, not stopping until I reached the safety of the nearest town. I never went back to Devil's Hollow. I sold the cabin to a developer who tore it down and built a new house in its place. But sometimes, late at night, I hear the voice in my dreams, soft, pleading, begging to be let in. I see the pale face at the window, the black eyes staring into mine. I don't know what I saw in those woods or what my grandfather wanted me to find, but I know this. There's something in Devil's Hollow that's always looking for a way in. And if you ever find yourself alone in those mountains and you hear a voice calling your name, don't answer. Don't open the door, and whatever you do, don't let it in. Those were 3 of the most disturbing, true Appalachian cabin horror stories I've ever come across. The mountains hold secrets older than memory, and sometimes what waits in the fog, beneath the roots, or just outside your door is far more terrifying than any legend. If you ever find yourself alone in a remote cabin, remember these stories and trust your instincts. Which story chilled you the most? Was it the lantern in the fog, the screaming roots, or the visitor at Devil's Hollow? Let us know in the comments below. And if you crave more true horror, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell for more tales from the shadows. Stay safe out there.